You taste iron in the air as laser gun tracers stitch the sky, and the men you're meant to keep steady look to you with open questions in their faces. A commissar's pistol is supposed to end panic, not to be hidden. When you turn your back on the parapet, you don't just walk away from the firing line. You walk into a different kind of war, and every consequence follows your footsteps. The standard snapped like a whip behind you, its cloth catching the wind and the light. It was the same sound that had steadied men through 3 campaigns, a familiar stitch of command and reason. Today it felt like a reproach. You could smell grease and cordite and the wet rag of fear beneath every man's breath. Tracers made patterns animals could have read as nests of fire. Somewhere to your left, someone swore, low and sharp, at the sky. You had the bolt pistol at your hip, heavy and known. You did not draw it. For a commissar, that small motion was an entire sermon, the barrel given to silence, ephemeral panic, the authoritative click that turned mutiny into obedience. Your hand did not move. Instead, you stepped back, putting your shoulder blades to the cold stone and letting your spine feel for a different line of sight. Captain Havel barked orders like a dog barking at a storm. He relied on momentum and noise, and the kind of certainty only men drunk on command possessed. "Forward," he shouted. "We take the ford at first light. The flank waits." His voice rode the wind and came to you small, like the echo from behind a hill. Men repeated the word like a prayer. Some of them believed it. Others believed only in the rhythm of their boots. The logbook from the artillery battery was an ugly thing, folded and stamped with imprecise numbers. You had not seen the whole sheet, you had seen a margin note, the thin loop of a bureaucrat's hand that said, "Correction, shift left 200, fall to 0. You had seen the look in the observer's face as he said the math wrong, watched his finger tremble over the map. You had heard the lieutenant try to readdress the battery, heard a radio click, and then nothing useful. Those sounds and that note sat under your tongue like a bitter seed. If the regiment pushed across the ford as ordered and the battery fired on the stated coordinates, they would walk into their own bombardment. You had seen similar mistakes before. The ground after was a cartography of grief, the kind that taught you to measure orders by the lives they invite. It wasn't about losing a position. It was about throwing half your command into the belly of a mistake and then standing proud while you buried them. You knew the code. You knew what the duty said about desertion, about cowardice, about the duty to fire that ended cowardice. You had watched other commissars make the easy choice and heard the tribunal hymn afterwards. You had seen the faces of the men who followed those commissars, and they had been empty. You had been a man in less time than it took others to become a machine, and you could not believe that mechanical obedience was the only proof of loyalty. Standing there, away from the parapet and closer to the back edge of the position, you felt the line fracture before any orders broke. Corporal Merrick looked at you like an accusation carved in bone. He had always been a man who loved clear things, a clean rifle, a clean kill, a clean command. "Commissar," he said, voice small and flat. He did not shout. He did not need to. His gaze did the job for him. It counted the bolts. It took measure. It catalogued your sin. A sharp shot nicked the parapet 30 yards ahead. A man fell silent and then breathed air that was not his anymore. He did not speak the way the living do. The sound of grief in the ranks is an animal sound, raw and animal, and it spread. No one moved to rise. No one moved to take the place the fallen man left. Captain Havel rolled his shoulders and tried to make the silence look like defiance. He barked again, and the bark was thinner. "You're abandoning them," someone snapped, a voice that could have belonged to a lad or a veteran, and the accusation stuck to you like wet wool. You felt every eye as a weight and every eyebrow as a verdict. The men who had expected the pistol to bite the air and end panic read your retreat as proof you had chosen the easy sin. Let them think it. They were not wrong in their sight. They were only wrong in the calculation. You explained nothing because there was no clean way to explain. Words crack when they have to hold lives inside them. Instead, you walked toward the narrow lane that sloped behind the trenches, where the ruined warehouses made a ragged spine against the sky. Your boots raised dust that tasted of metal and old rain. You carried your decision like an extra coat, heavy and hot. Private Lang moved to step after you. His jaw worked. His eyes were bright with a question that had teeth. "Commissar," he said, "you'll be shot for this. You'll..." He stopped at a look from Sergeant Dax, who had lines at the corners of his mouth that formed conclusions. Dax did not move. Men like Dax kept their mouths shut and watched the world fold instead. You had prepared for that stare, for the ripple of anger and the urge to replenish certainty with cruelty. The role of the Commissar is a rod and a mirror. Sometimes you must break men to save them, and other times you must spare them to break a system. The ink of regime law spells out what must be done, but the world on the ground writes its own brutal marginalia. You read the ground better than the book in your hand. A medic stepped up, his satchel clinking, smelling of iodine and boiled cloth. He did not look at you as much as into you, as if searching for a place to anchor his hands. "Why?" he asked, and it was the simplest and most dangerous question. Everyone knows why can justify both treason and salvation. Your answer would be a blade. If you had fired the bolt pistol at the first groan of panic, chaos would have stopped. It always stops for a moment when the barrel speaks. Men reorder themselves around the quick punctuation of a life ended. But that punctuation would not fix the coordinates painted by a trembling hand, nor would it mend the lie of a radio humming into empty. You could end the panic and then march them straight into death. You weighed the quick righteousness of execution against the slow ruin of being right. You had seen what came after a wrong bombardment. Bodies buffered each other like fallen logs, and the last sounds were not the prayers of the brave, but the surprised hearts of those surprised into death. The ground turned to mud and metal, and there was a long, stupid time where people tried to find meaning in the pattern of wasted men. You could not let that happen again if there was any chance to stop it. Captain Havel moved toward you then, his face flushed, his hands empty of the swagger he usually kept. "Commissar, you leave your post and you strip command. Stand down. Stand." His command cut off as if the order was too big for the air. You smelled his fear then, like warm sweat. Command without the men's bodies is a theatrics. The captain needed everything to be theater. You met his eyes because that was the place duty touched him. "They march," you said, voice soft, the kind of soft that makes men turn their heads. "The battery will fire on our coordinates. A correction is wrong. If we move now, we move into our own fire." He reached for the strap at his throat, a badge half hidden under a grimy collar. "You are a coward or a traitor," he said, the words sharp, close to the bone. "Which is it?" You did not answer. You had been called both before, and neither title changed the math. Names are tools taken up by the living. They will name you whatever the living need you to be. You heard some of the younger soldiers whispering, "coward" and "traitor," like a litany to make the world hold together. Their words warmed the air and burrowed into your skin. Behind the captain, a fresh rumble spoke from the east, the low building voice of the battery adjusting. Someone had found the channel. It was not a thunderous roar yet. It was a small mechanical singing like a throat clearing. The sound made the men flinch. It was the kind of thing that could be delayed with a pocket of time, minutes, perhaps less. And minutes in war feel like the span of a lifetime or the breadth of a fingernail. You had options so few they looked like lines on a ruined map. You could draw the bolt pistol and do your duty in the old, clean way. You could call the officer and demand recalculation by the letter of protocol and let bureaucracy attempt to save the men. Or you could step away, risk every accusation, and go to the observer or the battery to change the numbers with your own eyes and your own voice. You chose to step away. The silence that followed your motion was a heavy, bad thing. It sounded like accusation, compact, unadorned, and it rode you like a mantle. Men cursed, some under their breath, and some loud enough that the mortar crews heard. You felt hands go to straps, as if grasping for right answers. A few men walked with you at a distance, their faces split between curiosity and a desire to be seen keeping faith. Most stayed, and the parapet looked thin and vulnerable, with you missing from it. As you moved down the lane, the city opened in broken breaths, collapsed roofs, a clock without hands, a market stall frozen with abandoned jars. The smell of coal and old cooking hovered. It was a familiar theater of ruin. You kept your gaze forward. Behind you, the standard flapped, and for a heartbeat you imagined the cloth as an accusation thrown at your feet. It was a ridiculous image, a child's protest, and you let it be. Your intention was simple to state and impossible to predict. Find the forward observer, verify the coordinates, and if necessary, take the battery's gun officer by the throat and make him understand the math of blood. You were not naive about the cost. You knew the tribunal's appetite for spectacle, and you knew how quickly a commissar who forbade action could find himself hung as an example. You also knew a different ledger, the one inscribed in faces and names, not in statutes. A child of the city peered from a doorway, his eyes wide and unblinking. He had watched soldiers before, and he watched them now as if trying to learn the rules of them. You did not meet his gaze. Children record debts better than courts do. You thought of the ledger you would carry if you survived, tallies of men who went home, men who did not, names that would haunt you in any quiet. In the alley, you found the radio operator clambering over a pile of freight, his headset askew and eyes wide. He smelled of tobacco and ink and fear. His hands were on the console, moving in a desperate half-dance. "Channel's hot," he said. "They got the correction. Batteries on hold, for the moment." His voice wanted to be relieved, but it held too much strain. For an instant, you felt both the lift of hope and the press of urgency. The pause was a chance and a gamble. You had already left the parapet. You had already accepted the narrative the world might tell. You had to make the next move count. You tightened your grip on the bolt pistol at your hip, not to use it on your men, but as a weight in your hand, a tool to steady the shaking. Your next step would be toward the forward observer, and then, if words failed, to force the correction into being undone. You left the parapet and moved toward that intention, with the standard snapping behind and the line behind it thinning into the beginning of accusation. You walk the line like a rumor that won't settle. The trench tastes of metal and old smoke. Every step kicks up the dry grit of boot leather and the faint tang of cordite. Heads turn mouths close. Whispered syllables follow you, soft as the hiss of damp cloth. Coward, deliverer. A man who left his men to find himself, or worse, to find something sacred. The sergeant holds the spine of this company like a bad hand of cards. He moves between men with the kind of practiced anger that is half order and half prayer. When he speaks, the words are short, blunt. They are commands that try to stitch the ragged morale back into shape. Eyes forward. Fix bayonets. He slaps a shoulder so hard a man flinches and laughs to hide it. You watch him from the lip of the trench and feel the plaintive gravity of his effort. If faith were rationed, he'd be the one to smuggle it. Lieutenant Marek is in the command tent. You can smell the oil on his gloves as he taps the data slate, each touch a small percussion of accusation. He writes with an officer's neatness. The sentences will read like a weighing of crimes. You imagine the lines he draws through reports, neat, judicial lines that sharpen your absence into a charge. Dereliction of duty, failure to set an example, abandonment during engagement. He uses terms that will travel further than your name. The ink will make you a symbol overnight. A courier arrives with the order for inquiry before the ink on Marek's report can dry. The seal is a heavy thing, pressed in a way that looks ceremonial and cruel. The sergeant reads it aloud, and the words make the air colder. The officer who hands it over speaks with a clipped politeness that hides teeth. From regimental staff, he says, then folds his hands as if the rest is not his problem. The men listen because orders are the bones of the Imperium. They need bones to hold their flesh together. The order does two things at once. It gives a mandate, and it drags the conversation into daylight. Public procedure strips nuance and leaves only process. Men who might have called you a savior now line up to pronounce judgment because the document gives them cover. The world in a campaign is a ledger. Lines are drawn to be read, and reading makes facts out of rumor. Rumors shape behavior like weather. One corporal refuses to stand at the outer wire. His hands shake when the sergeant snaps at him. Another makes a show of volunteering for the next patrol, and there is something in his grin that looks like a challenge to whoever might think they'd earned the right to judge. The unit shrinks and stretches like a muscle that won't settle. You know the only thing worse than being deserted is being the reason a man dies for the face of a rumor. When the detachment arrives, it is not a single entity like rumor, but a concatenation of gazes. Two officers in immaculate grays walk with the kind of silence that says they've learned to carry judgment like a tool. Behind them trudge a squad of men whose faces look like they keep their thoughts in pouches, practical and parceled. The detachment is a question made visible, uniforms pressed, boots replaced, voices practiced. Their arrival diffracts the entire camp into an audience. They set up near the command tent, and the sergeant arranges chairs with the same fierce deliberation he uses on morale. The detachment's senior officer, Commander Var, a name given with minimal warmth, asks for testimony. Men are called forward like witnesses. Their stories do not agree. What passes for truth here is a deck of mismatched cards. One man, a heavy-set grenadier with a face like weather, says he saw you last near the burn pit, your silhouette a simple thing against the orange. I watched him go, the grenadier says, and his voice keeps breaking on the words as if they have a weight to them. Another, younger, says he heard you weeping in the night, then left to pray with the relic bearers. Marek's section gives a testimony ordered by time and duty. It reads like a diagnosis. Their voices are clean. They put your absence into neat, prosecutable steps. The camp learns to prefer clean things. You listen without speaking. Every sentence is a chisel striking away at a possible self. You can either talk and make what you sought into a confession, or stay silent and let the document draft your soul. Either choice will alter the shape of this regiment and your place within it. You know what you sought is a fragile thing, a small luminous truth that will not survive the hard light of official language. The truth was not a thing for orders. It was not a thing that fits into margins and signatures. Outside, the sky is a bruise, the color of old tin, and the cannons keep a low, bored rhythm in the distance. It is the sound of inevitability. Men shift in their seats, the rustle of cloaks passing like leaves. There is a boy near the back who keeps running his fingers along a faded patch of cloth on his sleeve. He stares at you as if there were a map of salvation on your back. He looks betrayed and hopeful at once. You feel the old, shameful hurt that people make gods of whatever they fear to own. Marek offers you a way out in paper. "Give us a statement," he says to the crowd, and the statement is a litany designed to dissolve shades into facts. The order of inquiry demands your presence in the tent. It is a tiny, bureaucratic imperative that feels like a trap. You see the map of consequences: file, hearing, reprimand, possible sentence. The machinery is slow and public and relentless. It also offers absolution if you say the right thing. Confess to fear, and you might be reassigned. Confess to abandoning to save something, and you might be charged with treason. The ledger has no room for the particularities of mercy. You think of the thing you sought. A child crouched under rubble with a medallion. You recognized a relic that hummed like a faint heart, a voice calling across the city ruin that you claimed only to silence in your own ears. Those memories are small and intimate, and cannot be made to conform to the tall, neat script of Marek's report. They would become curio evidence. Suddenly, the image of the child's hand in your glove would be turned into an exhibit. The relic's warmth would be called tampering. Mercy would be reduced to a clause. The tent crowd grows tight as the tape of inquiry winds through testimony. Commander Var moves with a surgeon's curiosity, but his face offers no mercy. Every question he asks is a wedge. He asks how far from the front you had moved. He wants times, distances, official logs. He asks whether you gave orders before leaving. He asks if you told anyone your intent. Each question is a small hammer. The answers you could give are small knives. Their shape is wrong for the wedge. The sergeant watches you the whole time. His jaw is a line that counts the cost of what he cannot control. He is not accusing you with words. He is refusing to be ruined. That is a harder thing than hate. It is the old soldier's economy. Conserve the men, even if it costs the heart. His eyes flick back to the trench, to the men who need a commissar to be a banner rather than a rumor. He has no trust left for miracles. At dusk, the inquiry breaks for supper, and the camp breathes in and out like a body trying to keep warm. Men sit around small fires. Someone plays a reed instrument poorly, and the tune slips into the air like a plea. You move through the light and shadow of those fires. A private falls to his knees and presses his forehead to the dirt, muttering words of a prayer you do not know. Another spits quietly into the mud, an ancient dismissal of superstitions. You are not alone in your silence. A woman from supply, thin, iron-handed, comes up to you and lays a ration pack at your feet without speaking. Her eyes avoid yours and say what soldiers say with food: "Do not die on us." The gesture is small, but it carries the weight of 1,000 shipments. You accept the pack. You accept her judgment and the thin forgiveness of sustenance. Night thickens and the detachment sets, watches around the tent like teeth. Letters are read by dim lamps. Names are tallied. The ledger thickens. Marek continues his report, adding lines that will only deepen the cut. Commander Var consults with a man in black cloth who arrived quietly with his own sealed orders. You have seen those men before. They are the ones who come when questions need answers beyond the reach of camp justice. Their arrival is a cold wind because they are shorthand for a verdict not written by this regiment. There is a crack in the regiment's cohesion that did not exist before. Men do not speak as much. Where they once traded jokes, they now trade facts, small and cautious. Trust becomes a ration tighter than food. The sergeant moves like a surgeon trying to keep the wound from spreading. He will not let the unit break under scandal. He will instead press a compress upon it, stitch by stitch. His methods are crude, but sometimes crude things hold. You walk the perimeter one last time before sleep takes you. The stars are blind and far away. The distant rumble of artillery is now a metronome for the camp's exhaustion. When you pause at the wire, a rat scuttles across the ground, tiny and urgent. It is a creature that does not know shame, only hunger. You envy it that simplicity. You know the detachment will not leave without a verdict, or at least a direction. The inquiry will continue at dawn. You can go to the tent and speak. You can confess everything, and watch mercy be boiled down to an administrative decision. You can deny, and watch your silence become a scaffold. Or you can find some third thing, a way to keep both the small truth and the men intact, to thread them together with a lie that looks like duty. The choice is not noble. There is nothing romantic in the way your hands tremble as you fold the ration packet into your jacket. But your hands remember the warmth of the thing you sought. You hear the child's voice like a bell in the dark, impossibly small and real. You are not sure if you saved a life or simply traded one pain for another. The ledger does not ask you that. You make your way for the command tent, not to answer, but to act. You intend to find the sealed reports Marek left on the slate and read them before Var prints them into ordnance. You intend to understand the architecture of accusation before you decide whether to tear it down or let it stand. It is the first small rule of any survival. Know the blade before you try to break it. The tent flaps give way to a pool of lamplight and the murmured calculus of men counting truths like flint. You slide inside and the air is full of the smell of oil and old paper and the small human thing that rises when a life is under inspection, the sweet, metallic tang of fear. Your hand goes to the slate on the table, and the world narrows to the weight of decisions you will have to make before dawn. The warrant burned through the static like a live wire. A Vox Bulletard proclamation, one sentence repeated in every market receiver and every soldered street post. Deserter, traitor, price on head. They said my face as if they could peel it from my memory and paste it onto a wall. The marble of the old civic column still showed their glue. I watched the pasted portrait flutter in ashwind and tried to imagine it wasn't me. I tightened the collar of my greatcoat against the dust. The city smelled of iron and slow smoke, like a forge that never finished. Every alley threw back my steps a half-second later, a small echo of the platoon that no longer followed. I kept my hands empty on purpose. A weapon in a commissar's fist is the only evidence they truly want. Without it, you look less like a criminal and more like a man who lost something he could not afford. They called me a coward for leaving the line. It was an easy word for them to throw. Coward. Desertion. It made the tribunal comfortable while their calculations remained unchallenged. But names are tools, and the tool that sticks easiest is the blunt one. The truth was a different, heavier thing. The truth fit into the hollow of my palm and weighed enough to change my gait. I had not fled for myself. I had left because the orders would have washed away a street of innocence like a tide and called it discipline. They had my men ready to shell a row of tenement blocks flagged as harbor for insurgents. The reports said insurgents. The corporal's eyes said women, children, and a gray dog that barked at the door. For a long, wet moment, the report and my eyes were at odds, and I had to decide which to believe. When I stepped forward and cut the pattern of that artillery with a single countermand, I felt the world narrow. Scent, sound, the clear metallic tang that comes before someone dies by official command. My order rerouted the battery. The blast that should have obliterated the row instead hammered an empty warehouse on the far edge of the map. Men cheered because the guns worked where they were told. The warehouse burned the numbers on the casualty lists read cleanly. The people on my street ran and survived. I do not regret the act. Regret is a lesser currency than the knowledge of a child's laugh saved from silence. But the cost arrived like a courier. The officers who lost that tactical hole wanted reason, not mercy. They wrote memos that licked the margins with blame. They logged omitted reconnaissance, failure to follow the chain, the commissar's absence from the fire line. It read like a patient counting of sins for a contrived ledger. To them, discipline mattered more than the glint of a child's eye. To them, I was an account to be balanced. The Commissariat balanced accounts without mercy. They issued the warrant because a single example steadied 10,000 wrists. I understood that balance in my bones. I had read the discipline manuals, bled for the formulae. Here, in the mud of a city that the war had turned into a memory of stone, the law's teeth waited. The choice I had made removed the bright, neat judgment of simple villainy and replaced it with something worse, ambiguity that infected everything. I found them by accident, the small knot of survivors who had sheltered on the far side of the market. They were under a collapsed arch where the fresco peeled, their faces firelit and careful. One of them, an old woman with a braid that smelled faintly of camphor, caught my sleeve and held it as if for balance. She did not name me a deserter. She called me by a word that had once been official and still had warmth. "Commissar." "Why did you leave the men?" she asked. Her question had the neatness of a shovel turning earth. She wanted to know the reason, because the cause made suffering either tolerable or obscene. The child beside her pressed an empty tin cup into my chest, as if offering proof that hunger exists and needs no politics. The child's thumb was sticky with jam. If I told them everything, if I spoke in the precise damning cadence that would place each decision on record, it would free them of suspicion. The military has a grammar for guilt, names, orders, timestamps. Give that grammar to the right offices, and the wheels of justice would spin. The Commissariat would examine the chain of command, rubber stamp what fit, and then snap its jaw. I would stand, and they would do what the law does best. Summary, public, final. If I kept silent, those people might remain under a shadow. The officers could still spin the story. They would call the survivors collaborators, scapegoats for failure. The lie would become scaffolding. It would prop up the official version of events and whisper to anyone who asked for a story. The line was held, the system worked, the deserter was a traitor. The survivor's safety would be a fragile artifice, dependent on their anonymity, on luck and faded memory. And me, by keeping quiet, I would be an accomplice in that creation. My hands had saved them. My silence would make them tokens in a far uglier truth. I noticed then the smallest thing, a matchbox, crushed, tucked under a boot. The child's eyes watched me light it with an economy I had learned in foxholes: strike, hold, shield. Flames made the woman's face a small brown map of worry. In that reflected light, I could see my own refusal explained. I had vowed, in a less formal time, to defend the defenseless. The vow had been practical then, a thing that saved rations and lives. It had become moral while my men still trusted my lead. Men who trust you make your obligations heavier. Tell them, the old woman said, not with demand, but with the observation of someone who had lived long enough to see doors that opened for the honest and doors that opened for the expedient. Her voice had no fear. I realized fear was often a moral compass. The absence of it made decisions sharper. The city breathed and coughed around us. Somewhere a sentry barked into a vox that the desertion tally needed reinforcing. Someone stamped a boot and swore because the ration convoy had been rerouted. These were small, ordinary noises that, in aggregate, made a public life. My choices had to cross into that life or be relegated to the private ledger of conscience. I had not yet decided which ledger was more binding. Memory returned as a sequence of tactile images rather than a tidy narrative. The corporal's hand on a radio, a child's shadow at the stairwell, the accordion clack of a battery re-aiming. My throat remembered the taste of dust after a command. When I closed my eyes, I felt my uniform as if it were a second skin, then muffled, as if removed. I had taken off my badge and kept it in my pocket for no one. When I rubbed the metal now, I found its edge rough. There were others who might have been told. An old sergeant who ran a repair shop on the east side still supplied our men with stitches and spare springs. He would have understood the strategic cost, and yet judged me lightly for saving one street. A priest at the cathedral might have absolved me, or not they have a habit of reading doctrine like a long, thin blade. I thought of the tribunal's neatness again. It pleased some people more to see punishment acted than to see a dangerous truth aired. Punishment reasserted the idea that the system remains intact. I could hear the word justice like a banner being unfurled somewhere distant. It arrived with a certain imperative, and yet the banners were often stitched from other people's cloth. The old woman watched me, waiting for the sound of a decision. The child nudged the tin cup, as if to remind me that life was not an argument to be weighed, but a presence to be kept. Then, unexpectedly, a knock. Not on my door. There were no doors here, but on a metal bin that served as a makeshift table. A man with a ratty coat slipped a folded scrap of paper into my hand and melted away before I could ask his name. The scrap was short, a time, a place, and 2 words that had the weight of invitation and threat combined. Archive Vault, it read in cramped handwriting. Midnight. Proof. Proof. That was the key I'd been trying to keep from myself. The archive contained records no one wanted to read because those records would either exonerate or condemn an entire chain of command. To retrieve them would be to force truth into a bureaucratic throat and demand it speak. To bring the records to a magistrate would be to invite immediate custody. To bring them to a public square would be to light a match beneath the commissariat. The paper trembled between my fingers like a small living thing. The night would be the place to move. Whoever had left it had risked their neck. Perhaps they wanted me to be captured. Perhaps they wanted me to deliver the killing blow to an unjust order. Perhaps they simply wanted to see the truth burn in public. I folded the scrap and put it under the badge in my pocket. The brass pressed into the paper, a twin weight. The old woman watched without asking. The child smiled at nothing in particular and licked jam from the corner of his mouth. I stepped back into the street, the warrant's print still rustling on the column behind me, bright as accusation. The city went on, indifferent and immensely alive, a place where choices echoed like artillery even when the guns had gone silent. I had a time and a place written on a scrap of paper and an old promise in my bones. I had to decide whether to go to the archive under the cover of the night and pull the truth out into the open, or to walk away and let the small group remain unexamined grief in a ledger. My feet chose before my head could make peace with the consequences. The decision slid into motion like a bolt driven home. I moved toward the shadowed mouth of the street where the archive's light could be seen, a single small lantern far down the lane. The warrant marked my past, the scrap marked my direction. The line I had abandoned had not closed. It waited in paper and in stone, and I walked toward it because I knew, at the edge of a war that had no moral cleanroom, that silence would rot the things I'd tried to protect. The paper felt wrong before I even read it. It was too light, like a lie wrapped in vellum. When I cracked the wax seal, I smelled dust and the faint, bitter tang of coolant, signs that paper had been sleeping in a machine, vault, not stamped and filed in the cold honesty of the bureaucracy. My glove trembled. The seal bore the mark of high command and a cipher I recognized from the morning reports. Sector Array 7, Special Directive. I unfolded it, names, coordinates. A terse line that read, in bureaucratic steel, hold position. Sacrifice platoon if necessary to deny planetfall. There was no flourish, no attempt to hide the nakedness of a calculation, sacrifice as a tool. The order had been buried in the kind of administrative language that breeds deniability, phrased so, a clean conscience could be manufactured when the coffins were tallied. I felt the room tilt a degree I could not account for, as if gravity had learned a new cruelty. I could hear them again, the ones with unreadable faces. Not the men themselves, but their echo in the staff office air, clipped voices, fingers tapping at relays, the soft rustle of robes that had never had to scrub blood from a collar. They had the sort of excuses that survived tribunals because they were abstract enough to confuse moral clarity. Tactical necessity, greater good, operational security. Each phrase like a small razor, precise and sterilized. The order in my hands was the blade they had sharpened. There are moments in a life of command when a choice compresses into a single hot point. I had made one such choice once, left the line, turned my back on a formation whose faces I knew, to break the chain of a scheduled manslaughter. The men I saved that day called me reckless. The men who had written the order called me insubordinate. The ones with durable excuses called me a problem. Now, holding their handwriting, I understood how narrow the corridor between sanctity and ruin could be. I tested the paper under the light. Each clause sat like a trapdoor. There was an addendum with a list of coordinates and 3 names crossed by a red slash, personalities within command who needed to remain useful. The implication was clear. The sacrifice was a ledger entry to be rationalized. The littlest line suggested a contingency for blame, the right scapegoats at the right time, groomed through omission and silence. You could bury an atrocity on 2 levels, under a mountain of official procedure and under the weight of human forgetfulness. The room was impossibly quiet. Outside somewhere, a loader rumbled, and the distant cadence of boots kept time like a war clock. My adjutant stood at the threshold, eyes wide and unreadable. He had come to fetch me for debriefing. I could feel his breath in the air, that metallic mix of engine grease and stale tobacco. He had a file tucked under his arm the size of a life sentence. When he looked at me, he asked nothing. His silence was a question. "You read it," he said finally, words soft as an internal confession. I did. I folded the paper and slid it inside my tunic. The ink warmed to my side, and the secret became something close to a living thing. Keeping it on me meant choosing a private, knowledge that would not stay private for long. I could hand it to someone official, hand it to someone dangerous, or bury it again and become part of the silence I had once broken. He wanted to take it from me. There was a moment in which his hand moved toward my belt. I did not stop him. The rarest power I possess is the ability to be patient when fury would comfort the blood. Our eyes met, and something like pity passed between us. He was younger than the order, younger than the men who had written it. He had not yet learned how easily righteousness becomes a weapon. Outside the warding glass, the platoon I had once left to die, then saved with the awful choicelessness of a man who flouted command, mustered in lines that looked deceptively whole. Faces gleamed with discipline under their helmets. I could pick out a dozen that I had placed, patched, scolded, and sometimes cursed at until they learned to stand straight. Those faces argued harder than any doctrine ever could. For a long while, I did nothing but count them. Each name on the list became a number. I tried to imagine the report that would be written if I revealed the order. The neat paragraphs where cause and effect marched in a row, where the men who engineered the sacrifice would be stripped of insignia and shunted into contested districts with nothing but their explanations. Some would be executed quietly. Some would be exiled to bureaucracy. Careers would topple like ragged statues. But the fallout was not just professional. Loyalty in our world is a currency. A public exposure would hand our enemies evidence they could use to break us. The administratum thrives on chaos. Rumors travel faster than warships. If the right shards of truth fell into the wrong hands, Entire sectors might realign against us. Lives elsewhere, countless lives, could be ruined or saved based on a single disclosure. I had seen the long arc of such consequences before. You do not get to sin once without creating ripples that knock over strangers. I considered anonymity. Leak the document without a name attached, let the scandal eat itself. The idea had a grim elegance. You could dismantle accountable power from the shadows and move on like a ghost. People would be freed. Men would be named as architects of atrocity and punished. But anonymity steals fear. Secrets without ownership become armor for the powerful. They can deny, deflect, and reassign blame to a faceless leak. Worse, the men who had authority could respond by tightening chains and increasing control under the pretense of security. An anonymous hand might save a platoon now and doom many more later. Another thought came that should have been simple and small, and it nearly strangled me. Confess. Take the document and hand it to the tribunal, with my own name attached, and stand in the open while they tear me apart. I pictured the chamber, officials with their unreadable faces, their robes starched and impenetrable, reminding everyone why obedience was demanded. I would stand there and say what I had done and why. I would accept the ruin. My confession could give the tribunal a victim they could not ignore. It could be the gravity that pulled people toward truth. But confessions are dangerous tools. A man publicly broken becomes a lesson, and the lesson may be twisted. They would eat me and use my shame to justify harsher discipline. They could paint me as a rogue element, a cautionary tale. The men who wrote the order would survive as the necessary architects of war, but with tighter control. My name would be on the record. My motives would be dissected. I could save others, but I might also validate the very system that produced the cruelty. In the end, the decision sat in my throat like a stone. I chewed it. I tasted iron and the dry salt of old regrets. I thought of the faces I had saved, the hands I had gripped in the dark as shells fell, and the world narrowed to the warmth of another's breath. I thought of the silence that had felled so many men before, the bureaucrats who had not toiled in mud or eaten with tremor. The calculus of war had been made by men who had never had to sleep in a trench. My adjutant cleared his throat. "We could bring it to Captain Havel," he said. The name landed with the weight of an offering. Havel's a man of good reputation and a stubborn spine. If anyone could process this through channels without it becoming a bonfire, perhaps he could. But the channels are not neutral. Bringing Havel into it meant a chain reaction of loyalties and grudges I could not predict. "No," I said, and the word surprised me with its exactness. I had formed a plan, a furtive thing with edges sharp as a blade. "Not Havel." He blinked. Then I go myself," I said. I felt ridiculous saying it. The Commissar's duty is spectacle. We are instruments meant to be seen. Yet there was a nuance between spectacle and confession that would change everything. I could step into the chamber, hold the paper in plain sight, and force the tribunal to take their own measure. There is a truth to public ruin. Once you offer yourself to it, you remove the possibility of being used as a lesson for others without scrutiny. Alone. His voice had a tremor. He wanted to argue the safer course he wanted to believe in. Anonymity, or in Havel, or in anything that did not require him to watch me burn. Alone, I repeated. I would not drag him into my punishment. He did not deserve that. He had not signed the order. There were practicalities. I wrote a note with a shakier hand than I preferred, folded the document around the affidavit, and tucked it inside a satchel used for court submissions. The paper rustled as if awake. I could not shake the sense that the building knew I was making a choice. The lights seemed to narrow toward me, and the distant rumble of boots grew louder, or perhaps my ears had simply tuned in to that rhythm. I dressed in my formal greatcoat. It smelled faintly of the tobacco my father favored, and of oil. Pinned my badge crookedly, the metal catching the light like a captive sun. The weight of ceremony felt right. If I was to walk into a tribunal, I would do it as a man who accepted the gravity of what he had done, who refused to let it be sanitized into an administrative footnote. I stepped into the corridor. Voices followed me, curious, quiet, a few sharp whispers like knives. People saw my badge and figured the story. Rumors are a kind of pretrial. I imagined headlines, thin and merciless. Commissar confesses. The thought did not stop me. I had learned that headlines do not hold the whole truth. They are designed to be read quickly and thrown away. At the end of the hall, a lift door hissed open. I stepped inside. The metal smelled like ozone and lavender from the building's cleaning wards. The lift descended past levels that housed people who wrote orders like mine, desks where rationalization was forged into policy. I felt absurdly exposed. The metal box moved like a coffin for the new thing I was about to become. When the doors opened onto the tribunal level, 2 clerks looked up. One recognized me and ducked his head quickly at the sight of my badge. He had been in my unit once, a corporal with a bad knee. His eyes flickered with something like relief, and then pity. I realized how many small debts and angles were in play. I had no illusions about what would happen next, but I had refused a safer silence. As I walked toward the chamber, the satchel at my side felt heavier. Each step was an argument. I told myself there was a difference between creating noise and taking the reckoning you're owed. There was also a danger in being known as the man who broke the rules. That name could be used as cloth to wrap the things the powerful wished to hide. I pushed open the tribunal doors, and the room exhaled cold air and a light that seemed designed to highlight every imperfection. Officials rose, a slow and precise movement. The chairman's face was an exercise in practiced neutrality. He gestured for me to approach. The clerks moved like trained predators, each one a notation in the ledger I now faced. I set the satchel on the low table between us and unlatched it. The paper slid into view like a living truth. The men in the room straightened as if they had been touched. There was a moment where the world paused, and in that pause the choice Id made felt neither grand nor small, only irreversible. When I spoke, my voice was steady in the way of someone who had chosen a path because there was no other honest step. "This is what they ordered," I said. "This is why I left the line. They expected a defense, a justification. They received instead a plain fact and the offer of my name." I placed my hand over the paper and did not step back. My confession had begun, and with it the possibility that accountability might actually be redemption. The chairman opened his mouth. Around him, eyes sharpened. The hearing had begun. My breath evened out. I had chosen to remain, visible, to let them tear me down if that was the price. Now it was their turn to answer to the truth I had laid on the table. I sat and waited for the knives. They brought the verdict in the raw light before dawn, while the camp still smelled of burnt ration and cold oil. The tribunal sergeant read from a ledger like a dirge, every syllable a small, deliberate knife. I felt the words before I heard them. Stripped of rank, relieved of duty, branded a deserter in the commissariat's ledger. They did not shout it. They did not need to. The echo of the sentence rolled through the tents and found the faces of the men I had left. Some looked away. A few watched with the kind of anger that had no patience for argument. One held my gaze and did not blink. He had been there when the shells fell. He had been there when I turned and ran. His silence carried the weight of a verdict I could not commute. They removed my palace and the holster from my belt, hands professional and unhesitating. Touch became accusation, leather against bone, the soft slide of cloth, the cold click of the bolt cutters on the chaplain's locket. When they led me past the muster line, the regiment's eyes were a geography of injury, a pale cheek where shrapnel had taken pigment, a jaw set against remembering, a hand that fumbled with the strap of a bolter as if wanting to test it by weight. No one shouted for my head. That would have been too clean. They left me the mess of silence, and it gnawed more than any blade ever did. Exile was a room with one thin window and the smell of old wool. They gave me a blanket and the commissariat's letter explaining the nature of my punishment, written in the sort of language meant to soothe the institution's conscience. They could not have known I did not need their comfort. What I had to answer for did not live in a formal script. It lived in the faces of the 6 men who had died because I chose to pull back the line. It lived in the 2 who had been taken prisoner, their faces still blank with shock in the last photograph I saw. The ledger's neat categories could not capture the particular shapes of those deaths. They could not measure a single moment of decision that made a life end, because decision is a weight that sits alone in the body. The regiment moved on, its colors less a banner than a map of grief. I watched their silhouettes leave the ridge like pieces in a game I had stopped playing. They marched with the mechanical grace of soldiers bound by duty, arms swinging in practiced harmony, boots biting the same rhythm into the dirt. There were whispers that followed them across the field like moths to a lamp. Traitor, coward, necessary evil, spoken in private as if to keep the judgment from hardening into law. The chaplain sent no sermon. He sent a man to see me for 1 hour, and in that hour we split the air between confession and condemnation until both had gone thin. He spoke of duty as if it were a blade, and I told him that sometimes the blade must be sheathed to stop more blood being drawn. He did not agree. He did not need to. He had the seal of the chapter behind his voice. I had only the sound of my own failing breath. They offered me mercies that felt like cages. A lesser punishment, a reassignment to rear logistics, a chance to serve with men who had never seen a proper frontline casualty. Any of these would have bought my name back from the Commissar's ink. I refused them all with the stubbornness of a man who had discovered that the thing he most feared had already been done. I had not saved everyone. That knowledge sat in me like a stone, dense with accusation. The stone made me slow to pray and slow to sleep. It made me move through the camp at night like a ghost policing his own cowardice. Rumor is a weapon in war. It cleaves truth and leaves both pieces bleeding. They said the commissariat considered execution a public display meant to keep other commissars honest and the men obedient. They deliberated on whether my abandonment could be held up as a cautionary tale, an example that conscience could be excised with clear procedure. In the end, they chose something more delicate and more merciless. They branded me a scapegoat. My name would be used to gloss over failures in higher supply lines, to cover officers' mistakes, to keep the regiment moving without the burden of systemic accountability. They wrapped their institutional failures around me like a cloak and sent me out into the cold. In exile, time has a different currency. The days stretched like leather, and the night folded me small. I learned the rhythm of my own breathing again, and with it the sequence of small absolutions. Boiling water at dawn, finding a book with no title plate, answering a stranger's question about the weather. Each small mercantile of peace was an argument I made with myself. Did I deserve them? Did the men I had left behind deserve my silence? The answers shifted like a tide, dragging and returning shards of memory. When I closed my eyes, I could still hear the sound of a particular shell fall, a hollow thunder that meant a man had stopped translating his intents into motion. It was a sound that carried the names of those who had not been given the choice I had. People came to me, sometimes with pity, sometimes with a harder face that wanted to test my resolve. A young corporal, someone who had never learned to be small in front of fear, asked if I regretted it. Every day, I said, which was true but insufficient. Regret was a landscape I could visit, but not live in. A crusty veteran spat and told me I had ruined his life because he had lived by orders and deserved the comfort of certainty. A woman tending the Commissar's garden handed me a half-rotten apple and said, without looking up, that sometimes you had to let a hedge grow wild to see what was hiding beneath. She meant nothing to do with military law. She meant that things left alone change in ways you cannot predict. The hardest part was that the regiment's injury became something else in time, a kind of narrative that people preferred, because narratives are tidy and the truth rarely is. They told themselves we had been betrayed by logistics, by poor intel, by the fickle hand of fate. My name was smudged into the margin of their stories. It became convenient to think of me as a villain, rather than as a man who saw more than one outcome. I learned that reputations are ovens that bake what they need out of raw events. They keep the living warm, but the burned anger was not mine to claim. I stayed out of their heat. Still, the world kept offering me chances to act in ways that might be called honorable. I helped a convoy reroute when a bridge had been sabotaged. I taught a pair of new recruits how to patch their breathing under shelling. I sat with a father whose son had been missing and confessed what I could from memory, which was never enough. The men I aided did not always know who I was or what I had been. Sometimes they called me Mister or Traveler. Once in a while, a voice would catch and say, "Commissar," and the question would hang between us like a coin tossed into deep water. I never asked for their forgiveness. I learned that forgiveness is a currency one cannot mint for oneself. Word reached me that my regiment had taken the grid city and had held it at cost. I read the dispatches with the compulsive attention of a man checking his own pulse. Lives were tallied and medals distributed. The incident I had run from was cited in official dispatches as a necessary sacrifice of a maneuver, a dark paragraph that allowed the rest to continue its tidy victory speeches. It made my absence an ingredient in someone else's success, and success tastes like a coin with the face of a stranger. I could feel the old wound ache when those names were spoken, as if tongues opened old scabs. There is an odd humiliation in being spared the final chapter. To be branded scapegoat is to be both condemned and preserved, made into a single, manageable sin so the machine can continue. It left me with time to think, and thinking is dangerous in a war that prefers decisive action. I studied the regiment's reports, looking for the moment my choice might be understood differently. I found small acts of kindness recorded, an officer sharing rations, a medic saving a man believed dead, and selfish acts listed with the same ink. The ledger does not pick favorites, it simply records what will be expedient to remember. One evening, a courier arrived with a packet, a photograph and a folded note. The photograph had been taken months after my exit. It showed the regiment around a battered standard, faces streaked with soot and pride. The note was from the man who had held my gaze that morning. The tribunal read the sentence. He wrote only, "We survived. I will not say you were right. I will not say you were wrong. I will say that some of us stood and some of us fell. You were not alone in deciding." His handwriting shook at the end. The note was a small, insufficient absolution crumpled into my palm. I folded that paper and kept it with me like a talisman. It did not restore what had been lost, nor did it lessen the knowledge that my conscience had a price. It did, for a moment, stop the damnable solitude that had been my companion. Standing by the thin window, the sky over the camp turning the color of old iron, I felt a current beneath me that was not yet resolved. The commissariat had taken a public measure against me, and the regiment had swallowed me as one would swallow a bitter herb. Both had moved on. Neither had answered the deeper question: could an individual conscience stand against the machine and remain human? My answer was not a speech, but a motion, I packed the packet with the photograph and the note into my few belongings and closed the weathered door. There were no orders, no map stamped with a new destination. There was only a path out of the garrison that led toward a town where rumors said a group of medics and misfits tended to the broken things the front did not want. The notion was not heroic. It was small. Go where the dying were uncounted, where a man could hand over what he knew and perhaps tip the scale for a single life. I left the camp not as an escape, but as a kind of penance, not because I sought redemption from a book or a tribunal, but because the only way I could reconcile the ledger in my head was to begin altering it by inches. As I walked, the morning light struck the pitted armor of a passing convoy, and the gleam made me flinch, like a memory of uniforms. I kept my head down and moved forward, carrying the weight I'd refused to be stripped of and the small hope that a conscience, battered and embarrassed, might still do some good in the unglamorous places war forgets. The road ahead was not a promise. It was an intention that required steps, and I took the first one,